everyone, my name is Jenna. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo First Nations. I am committed to trying to decolonize my teaching practice and ideally the education system more broadly. Lately, for me, that looks like trying to understand how to develop reciprocal and respectful relationships with the Indigenous peoples on whose land I am an uninvited guest. For my final project, I was really interested in exploring this goal of decolonizing the education system. So I looked at these three articles, Gaudry and Lorenz, Acton et al., and Corntassel and Hardbarger. All of these articles are looking at different ways to move education systems forward for the benefit of all students through indigenization. And they all explore different ways that Indigenous worldviews could be better incorporated into education systems. The central questions I had while working through these articles were, how can decolonization efforts ensure the cultural sustainability of Indigenous peoples? How can practicing teachers engage in transformative decolonization within the constraints of the academy? And how can non-Indigenous educators make space for Indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, and worldviews, and ensure they are considered valid and valuable? And that wording, valid and valuable, comes from Acton et al. So the first article I looked at was Gaudry and Lorenz. They were very concerned with how Canadian universities in particular have tried to indigenize since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So they identified three types of indigenization: inclusion, reconciliation, and decolonial indigenization. Inclusion would be including more Indigenous scholars and students. Reconciliation goes a bit further to include more Indigenous content and start to look at Indigenous worldviews. And decolonial indigenization, which is the one that all of the surveyed Indigenous scholars agreed was the best way forward, would be a complete transformation of the academy to better incorporate Indigenous worldviews while still respecting their autonomy and not trying to adapt them to fit within the Western Enlightenment education paradigm. Unfortunately, they found the academy has only really worked towards the first, least transformative type of indigenization, which is inclusion. And I think that, in my experience, this is what Canadian schools have tended towards as well, where they are willing to include more Indigenous content, but are struggling to find ways to really transform the education system to be more inclusive of Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. The next article I looked at was Acton et al. They were working from a very different context. They were looking at Australian institutions who have a stated goal to indigenize and also promote intercultural understanding, but don't tend to be able to accomplish this in meaningful ways. So they looked at a variety of different programs and ways to move forward. And they concluded that the best way forward is to embrace an interconnected combination of situated, plural, and reflexive knowledges that work together in inherently relational ways. And I chose this quote because I think it so beautifully and succinctly expresses what Acton et al. Are promoting, especially those three words: situated, plural, and reflexive. Situated because it needs to be really focused on a particular local context, because when we try to generalize too much, that's when things get kind of muddled and lost. Plural because we need to start to embrace a plurality of knowledges and understanding and recognize that there is diversity and heterogeneity even within Indigenous worldviews and knowledges. And reflexive so that we can start to look at the ways that we have been shaped by our Western knowledge system and start to really interrogate the ways that we have believed that knowledge is valid in the past. And lastly, I looked at Corntassel and Hardbarger. And I included this quote as an opening. It's actually from Leanne Simpson, but it was in their article. And it really frames their article and connects it to the land. So she writes, "Our knowledge comes from the land, and the destruction of the environment is a colonial manifestation and a direct attack on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous nationhood." I think this quote really expresses kind of some key points of Corntassel and Hardbarger's article, which is that colonialism is ongoing and Indigenous cultures are continuously under attack by colonial systems and by the way our society is set up in Canada and in North America. So Corntassel and Hardbarger, we're looking specifically at everyday actions of resurgence. So rather than only looking at indigeneity as it is often represented in protests, they also wanted to look at these everyday actions, things like the community values and Indigenous people's relationships to the land, foraging, farming, these kinds of everyday actions of cultural resurgence. So they were particularly interested in this idea of perpetuation. They worked with Cherokee youth in Oklahoma, and the two central questions they asked are what values, practices, relationships, and or responsibilities need to be perpetuated to sustain our lifeways as Cherokee people for generations to come, and what are the salient qualities of sustainable communities. These questions really resonated with me because I really appreciate how they're focused on how decolonization can and should be beneficial for Indigenous peoples themselves as well. Their finding, Corntassel and Hardbarger's findings, were that these are kind of the key values of the Cherokee youth and the key ways that they can ensure their own cultural sustainability. The responsibility of passing on knowledge by being a lifelong learner and teacher, the importance of family and community relationships as a site of learning and support through relationships of dependency, access to and protection of healthy ecosystems that allow for sustainable water and land-based practices. So my key takeaways in learning from all of these readings are, firstly, that education needs to change, not only at the K through 12 level, but universities too must be committed to transformative decolonization to ensure that our education systems are more inclusive of Indigenous worldviews and recognize that they are valid and valuable. Also, that decolonization can and should look like accepting and embracing multiple worldviews. Decolonization can also look like making space for people to continue traditional everyday practices. And again, this one is key because, as I stated in the beginning, I'm really committed to understanding reciprocal relationships. And I think it's important that decolonization isn't just viewed as something that will improve education for non-Indigenous students, but is also something that should ensure the cultural sustainability of Indigenous peoples and should be beneficial for them. And lastly, and this is probably the one that I will most try to take with me as I move forward after this course, is to be open and intentional in my learning and teaching of different worldviews and ways of knowing, and to embrace that complexity and messiness that comes with trying to understand different worldviews and trying to acknowledge that, you know, there isn't one objective truth that is Western knowledge. Actually, there are so many beautiful ways of viewing the world, and we could all benefit from exploring these different ways of knowing and being. Thank you so much for listening. It's been such a pleasure to do these readings and to really kind of open my mind further to these different ideas and these different ways of improving my practice as an educator. Thank you.